Sometimes a moment of cruelty can unlock a door you never knew existed. For Marcus Blackwell, a tech billionaire who thought his money could buy him immunity from consequence, that moment was throwing a Coke at a small-town waitress who had accidentally stained his designer suit. For Sarah Chen, a brilliant woman drowning in family tragedy while serving coffee to strangers, it was the catalyst that would expose a murder her family never knew had been committed. This isn't a story about redemption. This is the story of how one act of petty rage unraveled a billion-dollar empire built on blood, and how the most powerful man in Silicon Valley discovered that some stains can never be washed away. The fluorescent lights of Miller's Diner cast a harsh, unforgiving glow over the cracked vinyl booths and worn linoleum floors. It was 2:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, that dead zone between lunch and dinner, when time seemed to crawl through the small-town establishment like molasses. The air hung thick with the scent of grease and burnt coffee, punctuated by the rhythmic sizzle of the grill and the distant hum of an overworked air conditioner. Sarah Chen moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her white uniform crisp, despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She had learned to smile through anything, to make small talk with truckers and traveling salesmen, to pretend that serving coffee and clearing plates was just a temporary stop on her journey. But temporary had stretched into 3 years, and her dreams felt as faded as the motivational posters peeling from the diner's walls. The black Bentley pulled into the parking lot like a predator circling its prey. Its pristine paint gleamed under the afternoon sun, a stark contrast to the collection of pickup trucks and aging sedans that typically graced Miller's Diner. Marcus Blackwell stepped out, his movements sharp and impatient, checking his platinum watch with the irritation of a man for whom every second represented thousands of dollars. His suit was Italian, his shoes were handcrafted, and his expression carried the cold dismissal of someone who had never been told no in his adult life. He was in Millbrook on business, forced to drive through this forgotten corner of America to reach a manufacturing plant his company was acquiring. The GPS had died, his phone had no signal, and his perfectly ordered world had been disrupted by the inconvenience of human geography. He pushed through the diner's glass door with the force of a man who expected the world to bend to his will. Sarah approached his table with the same professional warmth she offered every customer, her order pad ready and her smile genuine despite the wariness that flickered in her dark eyes. Marcus barely looked up from his phone, barking his order with the casual cruelty of someone who viewed service workers as extensions of the furniture. "Black coffee, no sugar, and make it fast. I don't have time to waste in this place." Sarah nodded, maintaining her composure even as she felt the familiar sting of being treated as less than human. She had served demanding customers before, but there was something particularly cold about this man, something that made the air around him feel several degrees colder. As she turned to retrieve his coffee, she caught sight of the family photo tucked into her apron pocket, a reminder of why she endured these daily humiliations. Her younger brother Kevin's medical school graduation was only 2 months away, and every tip, every hour of overtime, every swallowed insult was bringing them closer to the dream their parents had died believing in. The accident happened in slow motion, as these moments always do. Sarah was balancing 3 plates on her left arm while carrying the coffee pot in her right, navigating between tables in the cramped space when a child's backpack, carelessly left in the aisle, caught her ankle. The scalding coffee arced through the air like a brown comet, landing with devastating precision on Marcus Blackwell's pristine suit jacket and custom shirt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady drip of coffee onto the linoleum floor. Marcus's face transformed from surprise to fury in the span of a heartbeat, his features hardening into a mask of absolute rage. Sarah immediately began apologizing, reaching for napkins, her hands trembling as she realized she had just ruined a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. But her words of apology were cut short by something she never saw coming, something that would change both their lives forever. Marcus Blackwell, tech billionaire and master of the universe, picked up his glass of Coca-Cola and hurled it directly at her face. The Coca-Cola exploded against Sarah's chest in a cascade of brown liquid and ice, the impact stealing her breath and sending sticky rivulets down her white uniform. The glass tumbler shattered against the floor behind her, sending shards skittering across the linoleum like deadly confetti. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the entire diner fell into a tomb-like silence, every conversation dying mid-sentence as 20 pairs of eyes turned to witness the aftermath of Marcus Blackwell's explosion. Sarah stood frozen, cola dripping from her hair, her face a canvas of shock and humiliation painted in high-definition detail for every patron to see. The sticky sweetness clung to her skin like shame itself, and she could feel the weight of every stare boring into her soul. In that crystalline moment of public degradation, something fundamental shifted in the molecular structure of both their worlds. Marcus felt the rage drain from his body as quickly as it had consumed him, replaced by something foreign and uncomfortable that he couldn't immediately identify. The silence in the diner was deafening, broken only by the steady drip of coke hitting the floor and the distant sizzle of the forgotten grill. He looked around and saw faces staring back at him, not with the deference he was accustomed to, but with something that made his skin crawl. Disgust. An elderly man in overalls slowly shook his head, his weathered face etched with disappointment that seemed to reach across generations. A mother instinctively pulled her young daughter closer, as if shielding her from the toxicity that had just poisoned the air. Marcus had never been looked at this way before, had never seen himself reflected in the eyes of ordinary people as anything other than successful, powerful, untouchable. But in this moment, in this forgotten diner in Millbrook, he saw himself as they saw him, a monster in an expensive suit. Sarah's response was not what anyone expected, least of all Marcus himself. Instead of tears, instead of anger, instead of the dramatic breakdown that would have been justified and understood, she simply bent down and began picking up the larger pieces of glass with steady hands. Her movements were deliberate and careful, as if she were performing a sacred ritual rather than cleaning up the mess of someone else's cruelty. She didn't look at Marcus, didn't acknowledge the gasps and murmurs from the other patrons, didn't even seem to register the cola still dripping from her hair onto her shoes. There was something almost otherworldly about her composure, something that spoke of a strength forged in fires that Marcus couldn't even imagine. When she finally stood, glass fragments cupped in her palms like broken dreams, her eyes met his for the first time since the explosion, and what he saw there wasn't hatred or fear, but something infinitely more unsettling: pity. "I hope your day gets better, sir," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more dignity than Marcus had ever possessed in his entire life. She walked toward the kitchen with the measured pace of someone who had learned to carry unbearable burdens without stumbling, leaving behind only the scent of cola and the echo of words that would haunt Marcus Blackwell for the rest of his existence. The other patrons began to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of judgment that seemed to follow Marcus as he stood alone at his table, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. He had thrown everything he could at this woman, had tried to break her spirit with the casual cruelty that had always worked before, but she had absorbed his worst impulses and transformed them into something that made him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. As he watched her disappear through the kitchen doors, Marcus realized with dawning horror that he had just encountered something his billions couldn't buy, couldn't break, and couldn't understand: genuine human grace. The drive away from Miller's Diner should have been a relief, a return to the insulated cocoon of leather seats and climate control that had always served as Marcus's sanctuary from the messy realities of the outside world. But as his Bentley glided through the tree-lined streets of Millbrook, something gnawed at him, with the persistence of a splinter buried too deep to extract. He had handled the situation poorly, he could admit that much, but people made mistakes when they were stressed, when their schedules were disrupted by incompetence. The rational part of his mind constructed the familiar architecture of justification, building walls around his actions, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had never been held accountable for anything. Yet every time he tried to focus on the road ahead, on the acquisition meeting that awaited him, his mind returned to that moment when Sarah Chen had looked at him with something that felt infinitely worse than hatred. She had looked at him with understanding, and somehow that made everything so much worse. The acquisition meeting at Henderson Manufacturing was supposed to be a routine affair, the kind of corporate theatre Marcus had performed hundreds of times before. He sat at the polished conference table surrounded by nervous executives in off-the-rack suits, their eagerness to please radiating from them like heat from a furnace. The numbers were favorable, the terms were generous, and the deal would add another $50 million to his quarterly profits with minimal effort. But as the Henderson CEO droned on about production capacities and employee retention, Marcus found himself staring out the window at the parking lot where a woman in a Waitress uniform was walking to her beat-up Honda Civic. She wasn't Sarah Chen, but something about her tired posture, her resigned movements, reminded him of the woman he had humiliated just hours earlier. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Blackwell found himself wondering about the lives of people whose names he would never know, whose struggles existed in a parallel universe he had never bothered to acknowledge. His assistant Elena called him twice during the drive back to his hotel, her voice bright with the artificial enthusiasm that all his employees had perfected. There were messages from board members, updates on stock prices, invitations to galas where he would be photographed shaking hands with other titans of industry who measured their worth in zeros and their influence in headlines. The familiar rhythm of his life beckoned to him, promising to wash away the afternoon's unpleasantness with the intoxicating routine of power and profit. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah Chen's face again, saw the way she had maintained her dignity while cola dripped from her hair, saw the careful way she had picked up the broken glass as if each fragment were precious rather than painful. He had thrown his worst at her, had tried to break her spirit with the casual cruelty that came as naturally to him as breathing, and she had absorbed it all and somehow transformed it into something that made him feel ashamed of who he was. The luxury suite at the Millbrook Grand Hotel felt smaller than usual, its opulent furnishings unable to provide the comfort they had always offered before. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the town square, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary lives with a fascination that surprised him. A father pushed his daughter on a swing set, their laughter carrying up to his 20th floor perch like music from another world. An elderly couple shared a bench, reading newspapers and occasionally commenting on something they found amusing or outrageous. These people lived entire lives down there, complete universes of joy and sorrow and hope that existed independent of his influence, his money, his carefully constructed empire. For 34 years, Marcus had moved through the world believing that his wealth made him larger than life, that his success elevated him above the mundane concerns of ordinary people. But standing in that hotel room, watching Sarah Chen's grace play and replay in his memory, he felt smaller than he had ever imagined possible. The woman he had tried to destroy, with a single act of petty cruelty, had somehow managed to crack the foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself, and the fissure was spreading faster than he could contain it. Sleep eluded Marcus that night like a debt he could never fully repay. He lay in the king-sized bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the afternoon's events with the obsessive precision of a prosecutor building a case. Every detail had crystallized in his memory with painful clarity. The sound of the glass shattering against the floor, the way the other diners had looked at him with unconcealed disgust, the careful dignity with which Sarah had gathered the broken pieces. He had built his empire on the principle that people were either useful or obstacles. That sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford in a world where weakness was devoured by strength. But lying there in the darkness, surrounded by thread counts that cost more than most people made in a month, Marcus felt something he had successfully avoided his entire adult life: the weight of genuine remorse. It pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, harder still to justify his actions with the familiar mantras of stress and circumstance that had always served him so well before. The next morning brought no relief, only the harsh clarity that comes when darkness can no longer hide the true shape of things. Marcus stood in the marble bathroom of his suite, staring at his reflection in a mirror that had been polished to perfection by invisible hands. The face looking back at him was the same one that had graced magazine covers and corporate boardrooms, the same one that had intimidated rivals and charmed investors into surrendering billions. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his features, something that made him look like a stranger to himself. He thought about calling his driver, leaving Millbrook in his rearview mirror, and returning to the safety of his Manhattan penthouse, where the memory of Sarah Chen's dignity could be buried beneath the familiar rhythm of mergers and acquisitions. Yet even as he reached for his phone, he found himself hesitating, his finger hovering over the contact list like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, paralyzed by the knowledge that some decisions change everything forever. The drive back to Miller's Diner felt like a pilgrimage, each mile stripping away another layer of the armor he had spent decades constructing around his conscience. Marcus had never apologized for anything in his adult life, had never needed to, because his wealth had always been sufficient to smooth over any complications his behavior might create. But as he pulled into the same parking spot he had occupied the day before, he realized with dawning clarity that this was different, that Sarah Chen had somehow managed to reach through his carefully constructed defenses and touch something he had forgotten existed. The diner looked smaller in the morning light, more fragile, like a relic from a simpler time when people still believed in concepts like basic human decency. He sat in his car for 10 minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to construct the words that would somehow make this right. But every phrase that came to mind sounded hollow, performative, like something his public relations team might craft to minimize damage to his reputation. The bell above the door chimed with the same tired wheeze as the day before, but this time every head in the diner turned toward him with recognition and something that felt dangerously close to hostility. Marcus felt their stares like physical weight, pressing down on him as he made his way to the same corner booth, where his world had started to unravel. Sarah was behind the counter, her back to the dining room as she refilled sugar dispensers with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to find purpose in the smallest tasks. When she finally turned and saw him, her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes, a mixture of wariness and resignation that made Marcus feel like he was looking at his own soul reflected in a funhouse mirror. She approached his table with the same professional composure she had shown the day before, but now he could see the strength it required, could recognize the tremendous effort it took to treat him with basic human courtesy after what he had done. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice steady and neutral, offering him a kindness he knew he didn't deserve. "What can I get you today?" Marcus pulled a small velvet jewelry box from his jacket pocket, the kind of elegant packaging that had always opened doors and smoothed over complications in his carefully orchestrated life. Inside was a diamond tennis bracelet worth more than Sarah probably made in 2 years, each stone carefully selected by his personal jeweler to catch the light in precisely the right way. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday," he said, his voice carrying the practiced sincerity he used in boardroom negotiations when he needed something from someone beneath his station. "I was having a difficult day, and I took it out on you unfairly. This is just a small token to show that there are no hard feelings." He slid the box across the scarred formica table, expecting to see the familiar transformation that occurred when people realized they were in the presence of real wealth, the widening of eyes and softening of features that always followed the revelation of his generosity. But Sarah looked at the box with the same expression she might reserve for a piece of roadkill, her face betraying no trace of the gratitude or excitement he had anticipated. Sarah's hands remained folded in front of her as she studied the velvet box, her silence stretching into uncomfortable territory that Marcus wasn't accustomed to navigating. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that seemed to fill the entire diner despite its low volume. "I don't need your money, Mr. Blackwell," she said, using his name with a familiarity that caught him off guard and suggested she knew exactly who he was. "What happened yesterday wasn't about a stained suit or a spilled drink, or even about having a bad day. It was about the fact that you looked at me and saw someone whose dignity didn't matter, whose feelings weren't worth considering because I serve coffee for a living." She pushed the jewelry box back toward him with one finger, the gesture somehow managing to be both gentle and devastating. "A bracelet doesn't change that. It just puts a price tag on your conscience." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true with the kind of uncomfortable accuracy that money couldn't deflect or influence couldn't diminish. The other patrons in the diner had begun to take notice of the exchange, their conversations dropping to whispers as they recognized the drama unfolding in the corner booth. Marcus felt their attention like heat from a furnace, their curiosity mixing with residual anger from the previous day's incident, to create an atmosphere thick with judgment. He had never been in a situation where his wealth couldn't buy him the outcome he desired, where his apologies were rejected, and his generosity was met with something that felt dangerously close to contempt. "I understand you're angry," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge as his familiar impatience began to surface. "But I'm trying to make this right. Most people in your position would be grateful for the opportunity to—" He stopped mid-sentence as he realized what he was about to say, the words "your position" hanging in the air between them like an accusation. Sarah's eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold recognition of someone who had just watched a man reveal exactly who he really was. "Most people in my position," Sarah repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made Marcus suddenly aware of how precarious his footing had become. "You mean most people who work for tips, most people without trust funds, most people who don't have the luxury of throwing tantrums in public because someone accidentally inconvenienced them." She stood up from the table, her movement fluid and controlled, and for a moment Marcus felt like prey being circled by a predator whose intelligence he had catastrophically underestimated. "I have 3 degrees, Mr. Blackwell, a bachelor's in biochemistry, a master's in molecular biology, and I was working on my PhD in genetic engineering before my parents died and left me responsible for my brother's medical school tuition. I serve coffee not because I lack ambition or intelligence, but because sometimes life forces you to make choices between your dreams and your responsibilities." She picked up the jewelry box and placed it firmly in his palm, her fingers ice cold against his skin. "Keep your bracelet. What I want from you isn't something you can buy." The revelation hit Marcus like a seismic shift, rearranging everything he thought he knew about the woman standing before him, and more disturbingly, everything he thought he knew about the world itself. The revelation that Sarah Chen possessed not 1 but 3 advanced degrees hit Marcus like a carefully aimed sledgehammer to his most fundamental assumptions about the world. He sat in stunned silence, the jewelry box heavy in his palm, as his mind struggled to reconcile the woman standing before him with every prejudice he had unconsciously harbored about people who worked in service industries. The biochemistry, molecular biology, genetic engineering, the interrupted PhD, the sacrifice for her brother's medical school, it painted a picture of someone whose intelligence and dedication dwarfed most of the executives who populated his boardrooms. Marcus had built his empire on the arrogant certainty that success was a meritocracy, that people ended up where they deserved to be based on their capabilities and effort. But Sarah Chen's story shattered that comfortable delusion like a brick through stained glass, revealing the ugly truth that circumstances, not character, often determined destiny. He looked at her with new eyes, seeing for the first time not just a waitress who had inconvenienced him, but a brilliant scientist forced to serve coffee because life had dealt her an impossible hand. The diner around them seemed to fade into background noise as Marcus grappled with the implications of what Sarah had revealed. Every interaction he had ever had with service workers, every casual dismissal of people he deemed beneath his notice, every assumption he had made about intelligence and worth based on job titles and bank accounts, suddenly felt like evidence in a case against his own character. "I didn't know," he said finally, the words sounding pathetically inadequate even to his own ears. Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through his attempted excuse with surgical precision. "Of course you didn't know," she replied, her voice carrying decades of accumulated frustration. "People like you never do. You look at someone in a uniform, and you see a role, not a person. You see limitations, not circumstances. You see someone who exists to serve your needs, not someone with their own dreams and struggles and intelligence." Her words were a mirror held up to his soul, reflecting back an image of himself that he had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid confronting. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the armor of self-righteousness he had worn so comfortably for so many years. The woman standing before him wasn't just more intelligent than he had assumed. She was quite possibly more intelligent than he was, certainly more noble, definitely more worthy of respect than his behavior had ever suggested he believed. "What field were you researching?" he asked, his voice smaller than it had been moments before. genuine curiosity replacing the condescending tone he typically used with people he considered his inferiors. Sarah studied his face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether his interest was real or just another performance. "Gene therapy applications for hereditary diseases," she said finally. "Specifically developing treatments for conditions that primarily affect children in low-income families. Diseases that pharmaceutical companies won't research because the profit margins aren't high enough." The irony was devastating. While Marcus had spent years acquiring companies and maximizing shareholder value, Sarah had been trying to save children that the medical establishment had written off as financially unviable. The weight of his own moral bankruptcy settled on Marcus like a lead blanket, making it difficult to breathe in the suddenly stifling air of the small-town diner. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to healing, who had sacrificed her career to support her family, who faced public humiliation with grace and responded to cruelty with dignity. And he had treated her like she was less than human because she happened to be wearing an apron when their worlds collided. The jewelry box in his hand felt like an insult now, a grotesque symbol of his inability to understand that some things couldn't be bought, some wounds couldn't be healed with money, some relationships couldn't be transactional. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the diner. "I owe you. I don't even know what I owe you." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she spoke words that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Blackwell, but you owe yourself the truth about who you really are when nobody's watching and nobody can benefit you. And based on yesterday, I'm not sure that's a truth you're ready to face." She turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his guilt and the terrible realization that he had just met someone who was everything he had always pretended to be: brilliant, principled, and genuinely worthy of respect. The drive back to his hotel felt like traveling through a different dimension, one where the familiar landmarks of Marcus's carefully constructed reality had been rearranged into configurations he no longer recognized. The leather seats of his Bentley, once a symbol of his superiority over the common masses, now felt like a prison isolating him from a world he was finally beginning to see clearly. Sarah Chen's words echoed in his mind with the persistence of a song he couldn't shake. "You owe yourself the truth about who you really are when nobody's watching." The phrase burrowed into his consciousness like a parasite, feeding on his growing awareness that he had spent 34 years avoiding exactly that confrontation. He had built an empire, accumulated wealth that could buy small countries, commanded respect from world leaders. But he had never once stopped to examine whether the man wielding all that power was someone worthy of it. The question terrified him more than any hostile takeover or market crash ever could, because unlike those challenges, this one couldn't be solved with money or influence or the ruthless pragmatism that had always served him so well. That evening, Marcus found himself doing something he hadn't done in over a decade. He researched someone who couldn't benefit his business interests. Using the private investigation resources he typically reserved for corporate espionage and due diligence, he began to uncover the full scope of Sarah Chen's story. The details that emerged painted a picture of tragedy and resilience that made his own manufactured hardships seem like theater performed for an audience of one. Her parents, David and Lynn Chen, had been killed in a highway accident 3 years earlier when a drunk driver crossed the median at 80 miles per hour. Sarah had been 6 months away from defending her doctoral dissertation when she received the call that changed everything. The insurance settlement barely covered the funeral costs, and her brother Kevin was already 2 years into medical school with another 4 years of tuition looming like an insurmountable mountain. Sarah had withdrawn from her PhD program, left behind 7 years of research that could have revolutionized pediatric gene therapy, and moved to Millbrook because the cost of living was low enough for her to survive on waitress wages while still sending Kevin money for books and rent. The deeper Marcus dug, the more ashamed he became of his own ignorance and privilege. Sarah wasn't just brilliant and selfless. She was everything he had always believed himself to be. Someone who sacrificed for family, who made impossible choices with grace, who maintained their integrity when the world gave them every excuse to abandon it. The research papers she had published during her graduate work were cited by scientists around the world. Her theoretical frameworks had influenced an entire generation of genetic researchers, and her abandoned dissertation had been studying a condition that affected fewer than 10,000 children globally, making it precisely the kind of unprofitable research that pharmaceutical companies avoided. While Marcus had been acquiring companies and maximizing quarterly profits, Sarah had been trying to save children that the rest of the world had decided weren't worth saving. The contrast between their life choices felt like a moral indictment that grew more damning with every detail he uncovered. He had spent his fortune on luxury cars and private jets and art collections that served no purpose other than displaying his wealth, while she had given up her dreams to ensure her brother could pursue his. As midnight approached in his hotel suite, Marcus stood at the window overlooking Millbrook's quiet streets, watching the occasional car pass through intersections where the traffic lights blinked yellow in the small-town darkness. The people sleeping in those modest homes below him lived lives of quiet dignity that he was only now beginning to understand, lives where character mattered more than net worth, where sacrifice was measured in opportunities abandoned rather than stock options exercised. Sarah Chen's story had cracked something fundamental in his worldview, revealing the hollow core of his own existence like rot discovered in the foundation of a mansion. He had convinced himself that his success made him superior to ordinary people, that his wealth was evidence of his worth, that his influence justified his treatment of those beneath him on the economic ladder. But standing there in the darkness, surrounded by luxury that felt increasingly meaningless, Marcus realized that he had been living an elaborate lie, playing a character in a story where he was the hero, when the truth was that he had been the villain all along. The woman he had humiliated in a small-town diner wasn't just more noble than he was, she was more human, and that recognition was either going to destroy him or transform him into someone worth being. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams where Marcus found himself sitting across from Sarah Chen in courtrooms and boardrooms, her quiet dignity serving as both judge and jury for crimes he was only beginning to understand. When consciousness finally claimed him at dawn, it brought no relief, only the stark clarity that comes when denial is no longer sustainable. Marcus had spent his adult life surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended on telling him what he wanted to hear. Advisors and executives and assistants who had perfected the art of making his worst impulses seem like strategic brilliance. But Sarah Chen owed him nothing, needed nothing from him, and her brutal honesty had stripped away the comfortable lies he had used to justify his behavior for decades. He realized with growing horror that he couldn't remember the last time someone had told him an uncomfortable truth, couldn't recall a single instance where his wealth hadn't been sufficient to reshape reality to his preferences. The isolation of absolute power had created a bubble around his conscience, and Sarah had popped it with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly where to apply pressure. The revelation that Sarah Chen possessed the intellectual credentials to run circles around most of his senior executives had fundamentally altered Marcus's perception of the world and his place in it. He began to see patterns he had been blind to before, recognizing the casual cruelty in his treatment of hotel staff, restaurant servers, cleaning crews, all the invisible people whose labor made his comfortable existence possible. How many brilliant minds had he dismissed because they happened to be wearing uniforms when their paths crossed his? How many Sarah Chens had he encountered over the years, people whose circumstances had forced them into positions that allowed him to treat them as less than human? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each one revealing new layers of his moral blindness. His private investigator had uncovered academic papers Sarah had published, research that had been cited by Nobel laureates, theoretical frameworks that had influenced genetic therapy protocols around the world. While he had been playing corporate chess with companies that produced nothing but profit, she had been trying to cure children that pharmaceutical companies had written off as economically unviable. The contrast was so stark, it made him physically ill. Marcus found himself compulsively researching Sarah's abandoned dissertation, downloading her published papers, trying to understand the work she had sacrificed to support her brother's education. The scientific language was dense, impenetrable to someone whose expertise lay in hostile takeovers and market manipulation, but he could sense the elegance of her thinking, the profound implications of research that could have saved thousands of children if she had been allowed to complete it. Her theoretical model for gene therapy delivery systems had influenced protocols that were now saving lives in hospitals around the world. Yet she received no credit, no royalties, no recognition, because she had been forced to abandon her work before it could be properly published and patented. The injustice of it felt personal now, a wound in his conscience that refused to heal. He had spent millions on art that served no purpose other than impressing other wealthy people, while Sarah Chen's groundbreaking research molded in university archives because she couldn't afford to finish it. The moral mathematics were devastating, a calculation that revealed the true cost of a system that rewarded wealth over worth, privilege over principle. By the time the sun reached its zenith over Millbrook, Marcus had made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 72 hours earlier. He was going to find a way to make this right, not with jewelry or cash payments or the performative charity that had always served as his indulgence for a guilty conscience, but with something that might actually matter. Sarah Chen had sacrificed her career to support her family, had abandoned research that could have changed the world to serve coffee in a small-town diner, and she had done it all with a grace that made his own struggles seem like elaborate theater. The least he could do was find a way to give her back what circumstances had stolen from her, to create an opportunity for her to return to the work that clearly defined her in ways his wealth had never defined him. But as he reached for his phone to begin making the calls that could change her life, Marcus realized with dawning dread that his investigation into Sarah's background had uncovered something else, something that connected her tragedy to his family in ways that made his treatment of her not just cruel but unconscionably personal. The drunk driver who had killed David and Lin Chen hadn't been a random stranger, and the truth of that connection was about to transform his guilt into something far more devastating, the terrible knowledge that some wounds could never be healed, some crimes could never be undone, and some people could never be forgiven for the sins of their blood. The name appeared on his computer screen like a curse written in digital ink: Thomas Blackwell. Marcus stared at the police report until his eyes burned, reading and rereading the details that transformed his shame into something infinitely more toxic. The drunk driver who had killed Sarah Chen's parents wasn't a stranger pulled randomly from the universe to destroy her life. He was Marcus's cousin, the son of his father's younger brother, a man who had borrowed money from the family trust to pay his gambling debts and celebrate his temporary solvency by drinking himself into a stupor at an upscale bar in the city. Thomas had been driving back to his apartment at 2:30 in the morning when he crossed the median at 87 miles per hour, ending 2 lives and shattering a third in ways that money could never repair. The Blackwell family lawyers had worked their usual magic, transforming vehicular homicide into a plea bargain that resulted in 18 months in minimum security prison and a civil settlement that the family's insurance had covered without Marcus ever knowing it existed. While Sarah Chen had been abandoning her PhD to serve coffee for survival wages, the Blackwell family had been protecting their reputation from the inconvenient consequences of Thomas's actions. Marcus's hands trembled as he scrolled through legal documents that revealed the full scope of his family's complicity in Sarah's tragedy. The settlement had been structured to minimize publicity and avoid admission of guilt, with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the Chen family from ever discussing the circumstances of David and Lin's deaths. Sarah's brother Kevin had been a sophomore in college when the accident happened, already drowning in student loans, and the family had needed immediate cash for funeral expenses more than they needed justice for their parents' deaths. The Blackwell legal team had exploited their desperation with surgical precision, offering a settlement that seemed generous to people who had never seen that much money at once, but was actually a fraction of what a wrongful death lawsuit might have yielded. They had bought Sarah's silence for less than Marcus spent on wine in a typical month, ensuring that Thomas could serve his minimal sentence in anonymity while the Chen family struggled to survive the financial catastrophe his selfishness had created. The moral mathematics were devastating. Marcus's cousin had destroyed Sarah's life, his family had covered it up, and he had responded to their first meeting by throwing a drink in her face. The revelation explained so much about Sarah's reaction to his apology, her refusal to accept his money, her bitter laugh when he had tried to buy his way out of guilt with a diamond bracelet. She hadn't just been refusing his charity, She had been rejecting blood money from the family that had already paid once, to avoid responsibility for destroying everything she loved. Marcus realized with growing horror that Sarah almost certainly knew who he was, had probably recognized his name the moment he sat down at her table, had served him coffee, and endured his tantrum while knowing that his family's wealth was built on the same system of privilege and impunity that had killed her parents and destroyed her future. Her composure in the face of that knowledge wasn't just dignity. It was a kind of heroism that made his own character seem microscopic by comparison. She had looked into the eyes of her family's destroyer and offered him the basic courtesy that human decency demanded, even when every fiber of her being must have wanted to watch him suffer the way she had suffered. The phone call to his father was the hardest thing Marcus had ever done, a conversation that stripped away decades of carefully maintained illusions about the nature of power and the price of protecting it. William Blackwell listened in silence as his son recounted the events at Miller's diner, offering no explanations or justifications for the cover-up that had allowed Thomas to escape meaningful consequences for his actions. "These things happen, Marcus," his father said finally, his voice carrying the cold pragmatism that had built their empire and apparently destroyed Sarah Chen's life in the process. "Thomas made a mistake. We handled it appropriately, and the family moved on. The fact that you encountered this woman years later is an unfortunate coincidence, but it doesn't change anything. Some problems require permanent solutions." The phrase permanent solutions hung in the air between them like a threat, and Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that his father wasn't just talking about the past. He was talking about Sarah Chen as a present problem that might require the same kind of handling that had buried Thomas's crimes. The conversation ended with Marcus understanding that he wasn't just the inheritor of a business empire, but the product of a system that viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of family interests, and Sarah Chen represented a threat to that system that his father would eliminate if necessary. The parking lot behind Miller's diner was deserted, except for Sarah's beat-up Honda and a dumpster that smelled of grease and forgotten dreams. Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing that everything he was about to say would sound like the ravings of a paranoid madman or the manipulations of someone seeking to exploit her fear for his own purposes. 3 years ago, a drunk driver killed your parents on Highway 52, he began, his voice barely above a whisper in the autumn air. The driver was my cousin, Thomas Blackwell. My family paid your family to keep quiet about it, and now that you know who I am, my father considers you a threat that needs to be eliminated. Sarah's face went through a series of transformations, from confusion to recognition to a kind of terrible understanding that made Marcus want to disappear into the asphalt beneath his feet. She had known who he was, had probably known from the moment he sat down at her table, but she hadn't known about Thomas or the cover-up, or the fact that his family's money had bought her parents' killer a minimal sentence, and her silence about the circumstances of their deaths. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, and Marcus watched her steady composure finally crack as the full scope of his family's crimes became clear. "You knew," Sarah said, her voice hollow with the kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any physical wound. "You sat in my diner, threw a drink in my face, offered me jewelry like I was some kind of prostitute you could buy off, and all along you knew that your family killed my parents and paid me to keep quiet about it." Her hands were shaking now, not with fear, but with a rage so pure it seemed to burn the air between them. The settlement barely covered the funeral costs. Kevin had to take out additional loans to stay in medical school. We lost our house, our car, everything, while your cousin served 18 months in a minimum security facility that was probably nicer than the apartment I'm living in now. Marcus wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known about Thomas or the cover-up until yesterday, but the words died in his throat as he realized how pathetic his ignorance sounded. He was 34 years old, heir to a billion-dollar empire, and he had been so insulated by wealth and privilege that he hadn't even known his own family was in the business of covering up vehicular homicide. His willful blindness didn't make him innocent. It made him complicit in a system that treated human lives as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of protecting family interests. "I didn't know," Marcus said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I found out yesterday after I researched your background, after I realized who you really were. That's why I'm here, My father made it clear that he considers you a problem that needs to be solved permanently, and I think you have maybe 24 hours before his people come for you." Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass that contained no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone who had finally seen the true shape of her world. "So what's your plan, Marcus? Are you here to save me out of the goodness of your heart? Or are you here to finish what Thomas started because it's more efficient than having your father's thugs do it?" The accusation stung, because it contained just enough possibility to make Marcus question his own motivations. Was he really here to protect Sarah, or was he just trying to assuage his guilt by playing the hero in a story where he had been the villain from the beginning? The doubt gnawed at him, but beneath it was a certainty that surprised him with its clarity. Whatever his motivations, whatever his family had done, whatever the cost to himself, Sarah Chen deserved to live, and he was the only person who could make that happen. The plan Marcus outlined was desperate and probably doomed, but it was the only chance either of them had of surviving the next 48 hours. He would transfer enough money to an offshore account to ensure Kevin could finish medical school and Sarah could return to her research. Then they would both disappear before his father's people realized what was happening. Sarah would need a new identity, a new life, complete separation from everything she had ever known. But it was better than the alternative that awaited her if she stayed. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice carrying the accumulated weight of 3 years of grief and struggle and betrayal. "Your family destroyed my life once already. Why should I believe you won't do it again?" Marcus looked into her eyes, seeing his own reflection in their dark depths, and realized that trust wasn't something he could demand or purchase or manipulate into existence. "Because," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of everything he was about to lose, "destroying you would be like destroying the only decent thing that's ever happened to me. You showed me who I really am, Sarah, and it was so ugly that becoming someone else felt like the only way to live with myself. If I save you, maybe I save something in myself worth preserving." The words hung between them in the cold air, a confession and a plea and a promise that would either redeem them both or destroy them in ways that Thomas Blackwell's drunken drive had only begun to imagine. The 24 hours that followed were a masterclass in paranoia and precision, as Marcus liquidated assets and moved money through a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts, while Sarah packed her life into 2 suitcases and said goodbye to everything she had ever known. They met in a hotel room 60 miles from Millbrook, both of them jumping at every sound in the hallway, every car that lingered too long in the parking lot, every phone call that went unanswered. Marcus had transferred $12 million to accounts that his father's forensic accountants would need weeks to trace, enough to fund Sarah's research for a decade and ensure Kevin could finish medical school without the crushing debt that had defined his sister's sacrifice. But money felt meaningless in the face of what they were both about to lose. Marcus would be disowned and probably hunted by his own family, while Sarah would have to abandon her brother, her identity, everything that had given her life meaning beyond mere survival. The mathematics of their escape were brutal, a calculation that weighed survival against everything that made survival worthwhile. They sat on opposite sides of the sterile hotel room, 2 people whose lives had become inextricably linked by tragedy and betrayal, planning a future that neither of them could envision. Sarah's goodbye call to Kevin was the most heartbreaking thing Marcus had ever witnessed, a conversation conducted in whispers and coded language that conveyed love and desperation in equal measure. She told her brother that she had been offered a research position overseas, that he would find the money for his remaining tuition in their joint account, that she loved him more than life itself and would contact him when it was safe. Kevin's voice carried through the phone's speaker, confused and worried and ultimately trusting, because Sarah had never given him reason to doubt her judgment before. When she hung up, tears streaming down her face for the first time since Marcus had known her, he realized that he had just watched someone die in the most literal sense possible. The Sarah Chen who had served coffee and maintained her dignity in the face of public humiliation was gone forever, replaced by whatever identity the forged documents in his briefcase would create. She would never see her brother graduate from medical school, never attend his wedding, never hold his children, because doing so would put him in the same danger that was forcing her to disappear. The cost of her survival was the death of everyone she had ever been, and Marcus was the architect of both her salvation and her destruction. The new identity documents were works of art, created by criminals who charged more per page than most people made in a year, transforming Sarah Chen into Elena Rodriguez, a research scientist from Barcelona, with an academic history that would withstand all but the most intensive scrutiny. Marcus became Michael Stone, a tech entrepreneur whose fictional biography included enough verifiable details to pass casual inspection, but not enough real connections to lead investigators back to his true identity. They would travel separately to different countries, establish new lives in cities where anonymity was possible, and never contact each other again, because any connection between them would create a trail his father's people could follow to its inevitable and fatal conclusion. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its requirements, a solution that preserved their lives while destroying everything that had made those lives worth living. As they prepared to leave the hotel room for the last time, Marcus looked at Sarah and saw his own future reflected in her eyes, the hollow existence of someone who had saved their body by sacrificing their soul, who would spend the rest of their life looking over their shoulder for shadows that might never come. The airport goodbye was conducted with the efficiency of strangers, two people who had shared the most intimate experience possible, the complete destruction and rebuilding of their identities, treating each other with the casual indifference of passengers waiting for different flights. Sarah's boarding pass read, Elena Rodriguez, Barcelona via London, while Marcus held documents for Michael Stone traveling to Singapore via Tokyo, their destinations chosen specifically to create maximum confusion for anyone trying to track their movements. "Will you continue your research?" Marcus asked as they waited in the departure lounge, the question carrying the weight of everything they couldn't say about loss and sacrifice and the terrible price of survival. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady but her eyes dead in a way that made Marcus want to scream at the injustice of it all. "It's the only thing I have left." She paused, looking at him with something that might have been gratitude or might have been hatred, emotions so complex they were indistinguishable from each other. "Thank you for saving my life, Marcus. I'll spend the rest of it trying to forget that it needed saving." The words were a benediction and a curse, forgiveness and condemnation wrapped in the same breath. When her flight was called, she walked away without looking back, disappearing into the crowd like smoke dissipating in wind, leaving Marcus alone with the knowledge that he had just destroyed 2 lives in order to save them. 2 years passed like a fever dream of hollow success and carefully constructed anonymity. Michael Stone built a modest tech consultancy in Singapore, helping startups navigate the complexities of international markets while avoiding any work that might attract the attention of major players in the industry. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was using the skills his father had taught him to remain invisible from the empire. Those same skills had built, turning corporate strategy into a tool for survival rather than domination. His apartment overlooked Marina Bay, a view that would have cost millions in Manhattan, but felt like a prison cell because he could never truly enjoy it, could never relax into the luxury because every beautiful sunset reminded him of everything he had lost. Sleep came in fragments punctuated by nightmares, where his father's voice whispered threats through static-filled phone calls, where Thomas Blackwell's car crossed medians in endless loops, where Sarah Chen served coffee to faceless billionaires who threw drinks with the casual cruelty of men who had never learned that other people's pain was real. The money he had stolen was more than enough to maintain his modest lifestyle, but wealth without purpose felt like carrying water in a bucket with no bottom, accumulating without meaning, growing without satisfaction. The news of his father's death reached him through encrypted channels maintained by sources who owed favors to Michael Stone but had never heard of Marcus Blackwell. William Blackwell had suffered a massive heart attack in his office, surrounded by the artifacts of an empire that had consumed everything decent in his soul and finally demanded payment in the only currency that mattered. The funeral was attended by politicians and CEOs and philanthropists who praised his vision and his generosity, while the obituaries painted him as a titan of industry who had built lasting institutions and supported countless charitable causes. None of the eulogies mentioned Thomas or the Chen family or the dozens of other crimes that had been buried beneath layers of legal expertise and strategic philanthropy. Marcus watched the live stream from his Singapore apartment, feeling nothing as they lowered his father into a grave that was undoubtedly more expensive than the house Sarah's parents had died trying to pay for. The death should have felt like liberation, the end of a threat that had forced them both into exile. But instead it felt like the closing of a door that could never be reopened, the final severing of any connection to the life he had abandoned and the person he had once been. The decision to return was born not of courage but of emptiness, the recognition that survival without purpose was just a slower form of dying. Marcus had spent 2 years building a new identity, but Michael Stone felt like an elaborate costume he wore without ever becoming the character, a performance that fooled everyone except the man staring back at him from bathroom mirrors in Singapore hotels. The Blackwell empire had been dissolved and distributed among various family members and investment groups, his cousins carving up the corpse of his father's legacy with the efficiency of scavengers who had been waiting decades for their opportunity. There was nothing left to inherit and nothing left to fear, which meant there was also nothing left to prevent him from trying to find the one person whose opinion of him might still matter in a world where he had become invisible to everyone who had ever known his real name. The search for Elena Rodriguez was conducted through the same criminal networks that had created her identity, private investigators who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found, hackers who could trace digital footprints through the darkest corners of the internet, where anonymity was supposed to be absolute. The Children's Hospital in Barcelona was nothing like the sterile corporate medical facilities Marcus had known in his previous life, where healthcare was a business and patients were revenue streams measured in billing codes and insurance reimbursements. Here the walls were painted with bright murals depicting cartoon animals and fantasy landscapes, while the sounds of laughter and tears mixed in hallways that smelled of antiseptic and hope in equal measure. Dr. Elena Rodriguez worked in the genetic therapy wing, where she spent her days trying to cure diseases that pharmaceutical companies had written off as financially unviable, treating children whose conditions were so rare that market forces had abandoned them to fate and medical charity. Marcus watched from the visitors' gallery as she explained a treatment protocol to parents whose faces showed the desperate hope of people who had been told too many times that nothing could be done for their daughter's condition. She moved with the same quiet dignity he remembered from Miller's diner, but there was something else now, a sense of purpose that transformed her from someone who had been forced to serve others into someone who had chosen to heal them. When she finally looked up and saw him standing in the corridor, her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes. Recognition mixing with resignation, as if she had always known this moment would come and had been preparing for it since the day she walked away from everything she had ever been. The conversation took place in the hospital cafeteria, a sterile space filled with the quiet desperation of families waiting for miracles and medical staff stealing moments between crises. Sarah sat across from Marcus at a plastic table that had seen too many difficult conversations. Her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold while they navigated the minefield of everything they couldn't say directly. She looked older, not just from the passage of time but from the weight of living a life that belonged to someone else, wearing Elena Rodriguez's identity like a coat that never quite fit properly, no matter how long she had owned it. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 years looking over her shoulder and had finally started to believe she might be safe. "If anyone connects Michael Stone to Elena Rodriguez, if they trace you back to me, then everything we sacrificed was meaningless." Marcus studied her face, seeing traces of the woman who had served him coffee with such dignity, but also seeing someone who had been fundamentally altered by the experience of dying and being reborn as someone else. The Sarah Chen who had maintained her grace under pressure had been replaced by Elena Rodriguez, who saved children for a living, but could never save the brother she had been forced to abandon. "My father is dead," Marcus said, the words carrying less relief than he had expected when he had imagined this conversation during sleepless nights in Singapore. "The threat that drove us into hiding is gone. We could go back, reclaim our real names, return to the lives we abandoned." But even as he spoke the words, he realized how hollow they sounded, how naive it was to believe that identity could be reclaimed like a coat left in a closet, waiting patiently for its owner's return. Sarah's laugh was bitter, tinged with the kind of sadness that comes from losing something so fundamental that you forget what it felt like to possess it. Go back to what, Marcus? Kevin graduated medical school last year and started his residency in pediatric surgery. He thinks his sister is dead. That Elena Rodriguez was a convenient fiction I created to explain my disappearance from his life. I've watched him through social media accounts that I can never let him know exist, watched him struggle with depression and survivor's guilt, because he believes I abandoned him for a career opportunity that was more important than family. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The knowledge that their escape had created casualties they had never anticipated, that survival had demanded a price neither of them had fully understood when they made their desperate bargain with anonymity. The children's ward was Sarah's sanctuary now, the place where Elena Rodriguez could exist with purpose instead of merely surviving with dignity. Marcus watched through observation windows as she worked with patients whose conditions were so rare they didn't have proper names, only alphanumeric designations that reduced human suffering to clinical abstractions. Her research had advanced significantly in the 2 years since her disappearance, funded by the money Marcus had stolen from his father's empire and channeled through foundations that existed only on paper and in the encrypted communications of lawyers who specialized in making charitable donations untraceable. She was saving lives that the medical establishment had written off as economically unviable, giving hope to families who had been told that their children's diseases were too rare and too expensive to warrant research and development. "This is who I really am," Sarah said, as they watched a 7-year-old girl walk without assistance for the first time since her gene therapy treatment had begun. Not the waitress serving coffee to billionaires, not the graduate student abandoned her research to support her family, but this, someone who can look at impossible problems and find solutions that no one else bothered to attempt because the profit margins weren't attractive enough. Marcus realized that Elena Rodriguez wasn't a disguise Sarah had been forced to wear, but the person she had always been, meant to become, freed from the obligations and limitations that had constrained Sarah Chen's choices. The goodbye was different this time. Not the desperate farewell of two people fleeing for their lives, but the acknowledgement that some transformations are irreversible, that some identities once abandoned can never be reclaimed. Marcus understood that he had come to Barcelona not to rescue Sarah from exile, but to witness the completion of a metamorphosis that had begun the day she picked up broken glass in a small-town diner with such dignity that it had shattered his world-view. Elena Rodriguez was who Sarah Chen had been meant to become, and Michael Stone was the man Marcus Blackwell had needed to become in order to live with the weight of his family's crimes. "Will you stay in Singapore?" Sarah asked as they stood in the hospital lobby, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a place where miracles and tragedies occurred with equal frequency. "No," Marcus replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I think it's time for Michael Stone to find his own purpose, to build something that matters, instead of just hiding from something that doesn't." They shook hands like the strangers they had become, two people whose lives had intersected at the moment when they both needed to die in order to discover who they really were when everything else was stripped away. As Marcus walked out of the Barcelona Children's Hospital for the last time, he carried with him the knowledge that redemption wasn't about returning to who you used to be, but about becoming someone worthy of the life you had been given a second chance to live. Michael Stone returned to the United States 18 months later, not as Marcus Blackwell seeking to reclaim a stolen inheritance, but as someone who had finally understood that wealth without purpose was just elaborate poverty dressed in expensive clothes. He settled in Detroit, a city that understood the mathematics of destruction and rebirth, where entire neighborhoods had been abandoned by capital and left to die before being slowly resurrected by people who refused to accept that some places were beyond saving. The foundation he established operated out of a converted warehouse in Corktown, its mission statement simple enough to fit on a business card: to fund medical research that pharmaceutical companies had deemed unprofitable, focusing specifically on rare diseases that affected children, whose conditions were too uncommon to generate the revenue streams that drove traditional drug development. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was using his father's money to pursue exactly the kind of work Sarah Chen had been forced to abandon, creating a legacy that honored the woman who had shown him the difference between success and significance. The Michael Stone Foundation became his penance and his purpose, transforming guilt into something that could actually heal the wounds his family had inflicted on the world. The first major breakthrough came 3 years after the foundation's establishment, when a research team in Montreal developed a gene therapy treatment for a condition so rare it affected fewer than 200 children worldwide. The pharmaceutical industry had ignored the disease because the potential market was too small to justify the development costs, but the foundation's funding allowed researchers to pursue solutions without worrying about profit margins or shareholder returns. When the treatment began saving lives, Marcus felt something he had never experienced in all his years of corporate success, the knowledge that his existence had made the world measurably better rather than just more profitable. The children who walked because of research he had funded, the families who didn't have to watch their sons and daughters die from diseases with names they couldn't pronounce, they were his real legacy, the only monuments to his life that would matter when everything else had been forgotten. He thought often about Sarah working in her Barcelona hospital, wondered if she had heard about the foundation's work, if she understood that every life they saved together was a small act of redemption for the lives his family had destroyed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered through the same network of intermediaries and encrypted communications that had once facilitated their escape from his father's shadow. It was brief, written in the clinical language that Elena Rodriguez used in her medical papers, but Marcus could hear Sarah's voice in every carefully chosen word. The research partnership she proposed was elegant in its simplicity. The Michael Stone Foundation would fund a new genetic therapy research center in Barcelona, while Dr. Elena Rodriguez would serve as its director, pursuing treatments for pediatric conditions that existed in the gap between medical necessity and economic viability. They would never meet in person, never communicate directly, never acknowledge the connection that had transformed them both from selfish people into something resembling human beings worthy of the lives they had been given. But their work would be joined in purpose. Two people who had learned that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past, but about ensuring that the future contained more healing than harm. The partnership would save thousands of children over the coming decades, each life preserved serving as evidence that some sins could be transformed into salvation through the simple act of choosing to serve something larger than yourself. The story of Marcus Blackwell and Sarah Chen had ended the day they walked through different airport gates toward different continents, but the story of Michael Stone and Elena Rodriguez was just beginning, written in the medical journals that published their research, in the hospital records that documented successful treatments, in the faces of children who would live to see their own children because two people had learned that the only way to survive the weight of your worst mistakes is to spend the rest of your life making sure those mistakes never happen again. Marcus stood in his Detroit warehouse office, looking out at a city that had learned how to rise from its own ashes, and realized that throwing a Coke at a waitress in a small-town diner had been the first step toward becoming someone he could finally stand to see in the mirror. The act of petty cruelty that had revealed the monster inside him had also created the only conditions under which that monster could be transformed into something approaching a human being. Sarah Chen had saved his life by showing him how ugly it was, and now Elena Rodriguez was giving him the chance to save other lives in return, creating a kind of cosmic balance that felt like the closest thing to justice that people like them could ever hope to achieve. Their names would never appear together in any public record, but their work would echo through generations of children who would live because two strangers had met at exactly the moment when they both needed to die in order to discover who they were meant to become. The epilogue came 25 years later, not in the form of a dramatic reunion or a Hollywood ending, but in the quiet dignity of a medical journal article that would be read by researchers around the world, but understood in its full significance by only two people who would never discuss it with anyone else. The paper, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, detailed breakthrough treatments for 17 different rare pediatric genetic disorders, treatments that had been developed through an unprecedented collaboration between the Michael Stone Foundation in Detroit and the Rodriguez Research Institute in Barcelona. The lead author was listed as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, with funding acknowledgements that traced back to a private foundation whose benefactor had chosen to remain anonymous throughout the quarter-century partnership. that had revolutionized the treatment of childhood diseases that pharmaceutical companies had abandoned as economically unviable. The children saved by their work numbered in the thousands, each life preserved serving as a testament to what could be accomplished when people chose purpose over profit, service over self-interest, redemption over revenge. Marcus Blackwell had died in a small-town diner the day he threw a Coke at a waitress, but Michael Stone had lived to see his work transform the landscape of pediatric medicine in ways that would echo through generations of families who would never know his real name or understand the crimes that had motivated his transformation. Sarah Chen had died that same day, picking up broken glass with a dignity that had shattered the worldview of a billionaire who had never learned to see other people as fully human. But Elena Rodriguez had lived to fulfill the promise of research that had been abandoned for family obligations and resurrected through the strange alchemy of guilt, transformed into grace. Their story had no witnesses, no journalists to document the unlikely partnership between a reformed monster and his victim, no cameras to capture the moment when cruelty had accidentally catalyzed the kind of moral awakening that usually existed only in fairy tales and religious texts. The final chapter was written not in words, but in the laughter of children who would live to see their own grandchildren, in the tears of parents who had been told to prepare for funerals, but instead attended graduations, in the quiet satisfaction of two people who had learned that the only way to survive the weight of your worst self is to spend the rest of your life becoming someone worthy of forgiveness. The story that had begun with a moment of petty cruelty in Miller's diner had become something larger than either of its protagonists could have imagined. Proof that transformation is possible even for people whose souls seem irredeemably corrupted. Evidence that redemption can be earned through the simple act of choosing to serve something larger than your own pain. Marcus and Sarah had destroyed each other in order to save themselves, and in doing so had accidentally saved thousands of other people who would never know that their lives had been preserved by the strange mathematics of guilt converted into purpose. The true measure of their story wasn't found in reunion scenes or dramatic revelations, but in hospital rooms around the world where children played with toys instead of receiving last rites, where medical miracles had become routine because two people had learned that the only way to live with the consequences of your actions is to ensure that your future actions create consequences worth living with. They had both died and been reborn on the same day, victims of their own moral awakening, survivors of their own transformation into people capable of making the world measurably better rather than just more profitable. The billionaire who had thrown a drink at a waitress and the waitress who had absorbed that cruelty with impossible grace had both ceased to exist, replaced by two strangers whose work would outlive them both, whose partnership would save lives for generations to come, whose story would never be told, because the most important stories are the ones written in the lives that continue, because someone chose healing over harm, service over selfishness, love over the comfortable numbness of wealth. Without purpose,